The galaxy was a vast and endless expanse, a place where power and survival were the ultimate currencies, a place where the Andromedan Empire and the Zorith Collective had waged war for centuries, neither side willing to give and neither side able to gain the upper hand. Entire star systems had fallen into ruin as the war spread like a disease, corrupting everything in its path, while countless species were caught in a crossfire hoping for an end that never came. The conflict had become a part of life. It had stretched so long that the once hopeful voices calling for peace had grown silent, and the thought of victory seemed nothing more than a fleeting dream. Both the Andromedans and the Zorith had grown too accustomed to war. It had become their way of life, their culture, their identity. The war was no longer about territory or dominance. It was about survival. The stakes had grown so high that the galaxy itself seemed to tremble at the thought of a final confrontation. Yet despite the countless battles fought, the ever-expanding fleets, and the unimaginable destruction, no side had gained any real advantage. It was a stalemate, the kind that made both sides question whether there was even a point to it anymore. Each battle had ended with casualties on both sides, neither able to press the other into a decisive defeat. Entire planets had been lost in the process, entire species had been wiped out, and yet the war raged on. The galaxy was tired, exhausted from the constant bloodshed and destruction, but the idea of peace felt like a distant dream far out of reach. Despite the billions of lives lost, neither the Andromedans nor the Zorith had shown any sign of surrender. They were too proud, too set in their ways. The war was simply who they were. The galaxy had grown weary of it. Was in the midst of another failed negotiation, another broken ceasefire, that the Galactic Council made a decision that would change everything. The Council had been established to oversee the balance of power in the galaxy, to prevent the endless wars between empires from consuming the entire star system. Yet even with their collective might, they had become powerless against the Andromedans and the Zorith, who had grown too entrenched in their conflict, too powerful to be reasoned with. They had tried diplomacy, they had tried sanctions, they had tried everything, but there was no way to break the cycle. The war was too far gone, too ingrained in the fabric of the galaxy. It seemed like nothing could stop it, not even the Council itself. And then humanity arrived. Humanity was a relatively young species by galactic standards. When the human fleet arrived, it was unlike anything the Andromedans or the Zorith had ever seen. Their ships were smaller and less imposing, but their design was unlike anything the two empires had encountered before. They were sleek, fast, and agile. The ships didn't follow the traditional patterns of galactic warships. They didn't adhere to the standard tactics that had become the norm in every battle before. Instead, they moved like shadows, darting in and out of the fray, catching the eye for only an instant before disappearing again. The Andromedans watched from their flagship with cold indifference, dismissing the humans as insignificant, while the Zorith were equally skeptical. They believed they had seen every kind of tactic and strategy the galaxy had to offer. Nothing about the humans seemed to stand out at first glance. But then came the first engagement. The humans wasted no time in making their presence known. They didn't sit back and wait for orders. They didn't form neat and predictable lines. They didn't even take traditional positions in the vastness of space. They simply attacked without hesitation. Their first move was nothing short of audacious. They struck at a small Zorith cruiser with such precision and speed that the crew barely had time to react before the ship was crippled. The Zorith weren't used to this kind of combat. They had trained to fight against calculated methods, against enemies who followed certain rules. But the humans didn't follow any rules. They seemed to attack on impulse, driven by something deeper, something that couldn't be predicted, something that was completely foreign to the Zorith military mind. As the battle raged on, the Zorith began to realize just how different the humans were. They were not simply fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. Every move was driven by pure necessity, not just tactics and skill, but a deep-rooted instinct to outblast, to adapt, to overcome. The Zorith fleet began to falter. Their highly organized strategies began to break apart as the human ships moved through their lines like a storm, catching them off guard with every twist and turn. The Andromedans, who had been watching the battle unfold from afar, started to take notice. They too had underestimated humanity's ability to disrupt the battlefield. Their precision and superior firepower had been their trademark, but they were too rigid, too structured. Their ships were designed for a calculated approach, a slow advance and relentless bombardment. They relied on their technology to give them an edge. But the humans didn't care about technology. They cared about results. The Andromedans found themselves struggling to maintain control of the situation. Their fleet was built to crush their enemies through overwhelming force. But the humans didn't give them the satisfaction of a straightforward engagement. Instead, they attacked from the flanks and then disappeared into the vastness of space, only to strike again from a completely different angle. Their ships moved like ghosts. Their tactics were erratic, yet somehow they worked. And as the hours ticked on, the Andromedan fleet began to feel the pressure. They couldn't predict the human moves. They couldn't track their ships, and worst of all, they couldn't stop them. No one had ever fought like this before. It wasn't just that the humans were fast or that they were creative. It was that they seemed to understand something that neither the Zorith nor the Andromedans had ever fully grasped. They understood the value of unpredictability, of being able to change the game at a moment's notice. They knew that war wasn't just about power or strength. It was about finding a way to win against all odds, and the humans were doing just that. As the hours passed, the humans' relentless attacks began to sow confusion throughout the battlefield. What had started as small skirmishes grew into a swirling maelstrom of unpredictability. Both the Andromedans and the Zorith were struggling to adapt their tactics to counter the human onslaught. But every time they tried to form a response, the humans would shift tactics again. It was as if they were reading the minds of their enemies, and every move they made seemed calculated to disrupt the rigid strategies of the two empires. The Zorith commanders were the first to falter. The Zorith were known for their precise tactical mindsets. They prided themselves on being able to outthink any opponent. They had faced countless wars and fought on dozens of fronts, yet nothing in their vast experience had prepared them for humanity's way of combat. The humans didn't follow patterns. They didn't form ranks. They didn't care about typical formations or classical maneuvering. They fought like wild cards, each ship moving with the sort of chaotic grace that the Zorith could not anticipate. The Zorith, normally cold and composed, found themselves floundering, and when the humans began to exploit this weakness, they hit hard and fast. They launched sudden and brutal attacks, with no warning, striking at vulnerable parts of the Zorith fleet. Where the ships were weakest, they picked off the Zorith's smaller vessels and then disappeared into the distance. Before the larger ships could react, the Zorith were thrown into disarray. Entire fleets splintered as captains scrambled to regain control of their forces. But the more they tried to regain order, the more the humans' unpredictability tore through their lines. It wasn't long before entire sections of the Zorith fleet had turned on each other. The chaos was spreading like wildfire, and the humans were feeding it in ways the Zorith could not contain. Meanwhile, the Andromedans were watching in growing frustration. They were known for their calculated precision, their ability to win battles with a cold and efficient hand, but they had never faced an enemy who fought like this. The humans didn't follow the rules of war. They didn't value strategy in the traditional sense. Instead, they simply responded to what the enemy did, and did so with an almost terrifying adaptability. Where the Andromedans would have waited for an opportune moment to strike, the humans struck immediately, catching them off guard again. And again, they began to realize that the humans were not only skilled in combat, but masters of psychological warfare. They learned fast. They adapted quickly. They could break any formation with sheer unpredictability. They attacked without warning and withdrew just as fast, leaving the Andromedans unsure of how to counter them. The humans used the terrain of space to their advantage, moving between asteroids or hiding behind gas clouds, so the enemy couldn't lock onto them. The Andromedan sensors struggled to keep up with the rapid movements and sudden shifts in position. At times, they could barely track the human ships at all, and when they did, it was already too late. The human ships were already out of range, or had made their strike and disappeared again. The battlefield was becoming a nightmare for the seasoned Andromedan officers and commanders. For all their technology and all their power, they could not control the one thing they relied on most: the battlefield itself. The humans had done something the Andromedans had never anticipated. They had turned the war into a game of cat and mouse, and the Andromedans were being forced to play by the humans' rules. The humans were relentless as the battle dragged on. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were changing the tide of the conflict with every move. Their unorthodox tactics had already put the Zorith and Andromedans on edge. But now something else began to happen. The humans weren't just causing chaos anymore. They were exploiting weaknesses in the enemy's lines with terrifying precision. It started with a single strike. A human commander, Captain O'Connor, had observed the Zorith's communication systems throughout the battle and had noted something odd. The Zorith relied heavily on their complex network of commands and precise coordination between ships. But they also had a key vulnerability, a slight lag in the transmission of orders. Especially when their fleet was under pressure, they depended on perfect synchronization, and any disruption to that system could send their entire battle strategy into disarray. O'Connor had been planning this moment for hours, and now the time had come. The human fleet moved in small groups, attacking the Zorith from multiple directions at once, causing the usual chaos. But this time the humans were deliberately focusing their efforts on the Zorith's communications relays. Without warning, O'Connor's ships launched a calculated strike right into the heart of the Zorith command center. A small but highly significant group of ships slipped through the enemy lines and unleashed a barrage of cyber attacks on the Zorith's critical communication infrastructure. The Zorith flagship lost all communication with its subordinate ships, and within moments, the Zorith fleet was plunged into chaos. The Zorith commanders scrambled to issue orders, but without the ability to communicate effectively, their tactical cohesion dissolved. The once unified fleet was now a cluster of ships, fighting blindly. Some turned on each other as they received conflicting orders. Others fell into defensive positions trying to regroup, but the damage had been done. Captain O'Connor's strike had completely destabilized the Zorith command structure, and the human ships wasted no time in exploiting the disarray. They pounced on the isolated Zorith vessels, picking them off one by one like predators in a pack. They took advantage of the confusion, hitting the weakest targets first and overwhelming them with speed and precision. The Zorith fleet began to falter. Ships that had once seemed unstoppable were now being torn apart by the human forces. Their once proud battle lines were crumbling, and their confidence was evaporating. But the Andromedans were watching. They saw the Zorith's collapse and knew they couldn't afford to let the humans gain momentum. They'd underestimated humanity's ability to cause chaos. But now the stakes had risen higher. The Andromedan fleet began to reposition itself quickly. They knew they had to act fast before the humans could build on their success and finish off the Zorith once and for all. But it was too late. The human fleet had already shifted tactics again. Captain O'Connor knew that the key to breaking the Andromedan resolve was not just in direct confrontation, it was in understanding their psychology. The Andromedans were patient and methodical. They valued control above all else. O'Connor's plan was to deprive them of that control, using calculated hits and feints to slowly destabilize their grip on the battlefield. The humans didn't charge headlong into battle. Instead, they attacked from unexpected angles, avoiding the Andromedans' heavy guns and using the vastness of space to stay out of their range. Their strikes were precise and damaging, but always fleeting. They hit and then vanished into the darkness just as quickly, leaving the Andromedans unable to retaliate effectively. Captain O'Connor's understanding of the enemy's weaknesses was beginning to show results. The Andromedans tried to regroup, but their confidence was shaken. For the first time in centuries, they were losing the battle, and they didn't know how to stop it. With the Zorith fleet in disarray and the Andromedans on the defensive, the battlefield was no longer the orderly, predictable place it once was. The chaos that the humans had unleashed was spreading like wildfire, and neither the Zorith nor the Andromedans could regain control. Every attempt they made to regroup was met with swift, unexpected strikes from the humans, who had already moved on to their next phase of the battle. The once confident Andromedan commanders, known for their ability to see multiple moves ahead, found themselves second-guessing their every decision. For the first time in centuries, they were not in control. As the humans continued to move through the battlefield like ghosts, their unpredictability became their greatest weapon. The Andromedans, who had relied on their advanced technology and tightly controlled formations, now struggled to track their enemies. The human ships were too fast, too elusive, and their tactics were too erratic. The Andromedan fleets had always counted on their precision and overwhelming firepower, but now they were faced with an enemy that refused to play by any rules. Every time they thought they had a handle on the situation, the humans would disappear into the darkness of space and strike from another unexpected direction. The human fleet was like a storm, unpredictable and impossible to predict. Desperation set in. The Andromedans had long prided themselves on their ability to impose order on chaos, but the humans were showing them just how little control they truly had. Their sleek, maneuverable ships darted between asteroids, using the terrain to their advantage, and making it impossible for the Andromedan gunners to get a clear shot. The humans didn't just fight. They played the Andromedans' strengths against them. The Andromedans' reliance on formation and strategy became their own downfall, as every time they tried to form up and present a unified front, the humans scattered and broke their lines. They didn't need to defeat the Andromedans head-on. They just needed to keep them off balance, and that's exactly what they did. Meanwhile, the Zoreth were not faring much better. After losing their communications and command structure, they had struggled to reorganize. Some of their ships had attempted to retreat, but the humans had anticipated this and cut off their escape routes. It was clear now that the Zoreth, the once proud collective of warriors and tacticians, were no match for the humans' relentless adaptability. Their fleet, once a well-oiled machine, was now a collection of fractured units with no cohesion. They fought not as one, but as individuals, and the humans exploited that weakness with ruthless efficiency. Every isolated Zoreth vessel that tried to flee was swiftly picked off by the humans' smaller, faster ships. There was no escape, no place to hide. As the hours ticked by, the pressure mounted on the Andromedans. They had watched the Zoreth fall apart before their eyes, and they knew that they were next. They tried to form new alliances, to strengthen their resolve, but it was too late. The humans had already breached their defenses, picking off their vulnerable spots one by one. They were no longer fighting a war. They were fighting for survival, and the humans had turned the tables so completely that the Andromedans were now the ones on the defensive. It was no longer just about the battle. It was about the survival of two galactic empires, and the humans had shown the galaxy something it had never seen before: the power of unpredictability, creativity, and relentless will. The Andromedans and Zoreth were on the verge of collapse, and the humans had only just begun. With each passing hour, the gap between the humans and their adversaries widened. The Zoreth, once known for their cunning and meticulous planning, were now disintegrating on all fronts. Their fleet was scattered, their commanders lost in a mess of conflicting orders. Every time they tried to regroup, the humans were already on them, swift and relentless. There was no room to breathe, no time to reorganize. The Zoreth had underestimated the humans' ability to adapt, and now they were paying the price. The Andromedans were not much better off. Though they were still a formidable force, the cracks in their once impenetrable defense were becoming more evident with every minute that passed. Their fleets, once a cohesive and unified force, now struggled to coordinate their attacks. They had spent centuries perfecting the art of war, relying on precision and overwhelming firepower, but the humans had dismantled their strategy piece by piece. Every move they made was countered by the humans with ease. The Andromedans were a step behind, their cold, calculated tactics faltering against the chaos the humans had created. The battlefield had become a puzzle they could no longer solve. Captain O'Connor knew that this was the moment to strike the final blow. The Zoreth were teetering on the edge of defeat, their morale shattered. The Andromedans, though still a threat, were on the ropes. O'Connor's fleet had done the unthinkable. They had turned the tide of a galactic war that had been raging for centuries. Now, all that was left was to push the advantage and break their enemies completely. The human commanders had a simple goal: to force the Andromedans into a retreat and finish off the remnants of the Zoreth fleet. But in this moment of victory, there was no room for hesitation. The humans could not afford to allow the Andromedans to regroup or the Zoreth to retreat and reorganize. Every moment counted, and O'Connor wasn't about to let them escape. The human fleet surged forward in a coordinated assault, their ships darting in and out of enemy lines, attacking from angles the Andromedans couldn't even predict. They targeted the Andromedans' weakest points, their smaller, more vulnerable ships. Every human ship was a weapon, but it was their will, their unrelenting drive, that made them formidable. The Andromedans' heavy firepower was still a threat, but it was increasingly ineffective as the humans continued to harry them, forcing them into defensive positions they could not escape from. It wasn't just about destroying ships anymore. O'Connor's fleet was systematically wearing down the Andromedans' resolve. Each strike, each small victory chipped away at their confidence. The once imposing fleet was slowly turning into a broken shadow of itself. The Andromedans tried to form new formations, tried to make a stand, but the humans had anticipated this. Every time they attempted a counterattack, they found themselves outflanked. Their own officers were beginning to question their orders, and their morale was crumbling. Meanwhile, the Zoreth, who had been forced into retreat, were now pinned down. With their command structure broken and their fleet scattered, the humans were picking them off with surgical precision. The Zoreth had no hope of regrouping. What little remained of their forces were now trapped in a web of human ships, unable to escape or defend themselves. It was only a matter of time before the final blow was delivered. The humans had shown that victory wasn't just about technology or numbers. It was about adaptability, determination, and the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. As the Andromedan flagship began to signal retreat, and the Zoreth ships scattered into space, the humans knew that the battle was theirs. The war that had been fought for centuries was finally coming to an end. But even as the Zoreth and Andromedans faced their impending collapse, O'Connor knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy had witnessed something extraordinary, the power of a species who refused to bend to the will of others. The humans had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was always a way to win. The war was nearly over, but the lessons learned would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. The final hours of the battle were a blur of explosions and fleeing ships. The Zoreth fleet had been decimated, their once proud armada now reduced to scattered debris and shattered remains. The Andromedans, who had held firm for so long, were retreating in disarray, their meticulously planned formations now shattered by the relentless human onslaught. What had begun as a war between two mighty empires was now ending in the most unexpected of ways. At the hands of the species the galaxy had once dismissed as insignificant. Captain O'Connor stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final stages of the battle unfold on the large viewing screen. The Zoreth were finished. The Andromedans were too scattered to pose any real threat now. His fleet had taken heavy losses, but they had done what was once thought impossible. They had defeated the most powerful forces in the galaxy in less than 5 hours. "Final counts coming in, sir," said Lieutenant Adams, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Zoreth fleet is down to 20% of its original strength. Andromedan fleet has pulled back from the front lines. The remaining ships are in full retreat." O'Connor nodded grimly. They had done it, but the victory felt hollow. The war was over, yes, but at what cost? The galaxy had been scared by the conflict, countless worlds torn apart in the wake of the Andromedans and Zoreth's relentless battles. And now, even as the humans celebrated their triumph, they were left to wonder what would come next. They had fought not just for survival, but for something greater. A chance to rewrite the galaxy's history, to prove that even the smallest, most underestimated species could stand up to giants and win. "Set course for the Zoreth capital," O'Connor ordered, his voice firm. "Let's make sure they know this is over." The human fleet moved swiftly, their ships still darting through space with incredible speed. The Andromedans, realizing the war was lost, had already begun negotiating terms of surrender. Their fleet, once a symbol of unmatched power, had crumbled beneath the weight of the human approach to combat. The Zoreth, meanwhile, were reeling from their loss. Their pride had been shattered, their forces broken, and the surviving ships were now retreating to their homeworlds, unsure of what the future would hold. As O'Connor's fleet approached the Zoreth capital, they sent out a message, a simple, direct transmission to the leaders of the Zoreth and Andromedan forces alike. It was time to negotiate the terms of peace, to bring an end to the centuries of bloodshed. The message was clear. Humanity had come, not to conquer, but to end the war, to build something new. The two empires had held the galaxy in a grip of terror for long enough. But now, a new power had risen, one that was unafraid to fight for what was right. The human message resonated with the galaxy's other species, who had watched helplessly as the war raged on. They too had suffered. They too had been caught in the crossfire. And now, they saw a new hope rising from the ashes of the old. Within hours, the formal negotiations began. The Zoreth and Andromedans, broken and battered, were forced to listen. They had no choice. The humans had proven that they could win, even against overwhelming odds. It was a new era, one in which the old powers no longer ruled with an iron fist. The treaty that followed would be known throughout the galaxy as the Human Accord. It was a new chapter in galactic history, one in which humanity not only survived but thrived. They had shown the galaxy that there was more to warfare than brute strength and advanced technology. It was about the heart, the will to fight for what was right, and the determination to adapt to any challenge. The war that had lasted centuries had been ended in just 5 hours. The galaxy would never be the same.